Super good to see the three of you. Thank you for joining us today. Let's hop right in. First, I'd like to introduce Andy Bromberg from Coinlist. Yep, he's waving. I'd like to introduce Erik Trautman, CEO at Near Foundation, and Min Teo, who's a partner at ConsenSys Labs Investments. Great. So I think what would be good immediately, and I think we want to hop right to it, given the timing and so forth, is to define for people what community means, better than a dictionary definition, and particularly in the context of Web3, because I think that we can bifurcate or trifurcate a little bit. There are different aspects to it, and why it's so very critical. I think, although that may be obvious to many people, I think it's good to lay it out. So who wants to start? Min, do you want to start with a discussion on that topic first, or some definitions? And feel free, by the way, to just talk a little bit about how you came into this and your organization whilst we get going.
Sure thing. So I've been with ConsenSys for 2 years now, leading investments for them. And we're a global software company focused on building decentralized applications and infrastructure. The word community is an interesting one. I think, having been involved in the space for a few years, but really working in it full time for the last 2 years, it was definitely something new for me to understand and get my head around. I think in evaluating sort of potential investments right now, we really think about how is a project incentivizing present and future stakeholders and ensuring that, they're excited, they're bought into the project success, they feel like they have ownership and a stake in the future. Curious to hear other people's interpretations of it.
Erik, do you want to get next?
Yeah, sure. I could just do the quick introduction as well. So I'm with Near Protocol. I work at the Near Foundation, and Near is a layer 1 blockchain. So it's a smart contract platform that's designed to be highly scalable. We really focus on helping developers create apps that real people can actually use. So when we think about community, we're primarily thinking about how do we help developers and how do we help developers help their end users as much as possible. And so I think to me, the difference between community and users is users drop in, they accomplish their goal, and they leave. Community cares about the future of your project, not just your product. And I think there's a subtle but important difference there. So I mean, kind of a product metric that's often used is how many people will care if your product disappears. And I think a good community metric is how many people will care if your project disappears. Because these are decentralized projects, of course, after they're launched, the entire team could walk away and disappear forever. And theoretically, the network will keep humming along as long as you have validators who are incentivized to stick around. Do people pick up that slack and then step forward and then want to continue and figure out how do we make this project continue forward? I think that's one of the most crucial aspects of creating a successful community in this space here.
Yeah, kind of a component of anti-fragility, if you will. But so Andy, you've had a lot of experience in helping a lot of different projects. So it's got rich experience to come onto this, and I remember the first panel we're on together. Actually, you did. Would you care to kind of classify things and talk about the different mechanisms, particularly perhaps for bringing people into the community and getting them excited, not just through sort of emotional ownership, but beyond that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think interesting to hear Erik's response too in terms of separating users and community. It's an interesting angle. When I think of community, what I think is interesting about crypto projects as a whole, Web3 projects as a whole, is that there's so many different components of what the community can mean. And again, this is just in my eyes. So community can be the developers that are building applications on top of a protocol, or businesses on top of a protocol. Community can be the set of validators, if that's irrelevant. Community can be end users that are using the products that developers are building on top of the network. Community can be holders, people who care about the asset of the network and are incentivized to hold it or trade it or be participants in kind of the market side of the network. And those are all such different components. I believe that these decentralized networks need all of them, and they need to have all of these networks be really active. If you look at the most successful digital asset out there today, which is Bitcoin, it has this. It has a massive developer community. It has a massive end user community. It has a massive kind of financial and markets community. It has a massive mining community. And so all of those pieces together are what make it successful. And there's a lot that can be done to incentivize that community. Broadly, two components or two ways that you can drive those various communities or sub-communities. One is what Min mentioned, which is incentives in the network. So what's built into the protocol or the network that will incentivize properly these different parties to behave well and be additive and be good members of the community. And then separately, there are, for certain cases, and Erik's an expert on this, he can speak more to it, for if there is a foundation or an organization that's at some level kind of leading the growth, if not actually managing the network, but kind of leading it and having some sort of moral authority, what are they doing to incentivize these different community members or sub-communities to behave well? So there's the built-in incentives, and then there's kind of these extrinsic, more kind of human-led incentives to drive a strong community for a different project.
Great. So picking up on that, we talked about how important it is to have such a widespread allocation of these different incentives to many different participants in ACN network or community members. How do you measure how much is enough in terms of the distribution of those incentives? How do you think about those metrics and setting those targets, if you will? And then there are different techniques of getting it to different parties. I think that's we can perhaps pick up on that. But how do you also structure the decision making about those allocations, given that these are meant to be a decentralized organization, and this has been discussed a little bit in the day? It may not be immediately decentralized, but those two things together. What are the targets? How do you set them in terms of scope of decentralization, and how do you make the choices of precisely who gets to benefit? Who wants to take that first? Min, do you want? We'll keep on going around in that order. So, Min, do you want to tackle that a little bit?
Sure. I can share a little bit of some of the initiatives that we have with ConsenSys as it relates to the Ethereum community, more specifically with Gitcoin. So we do believe that, when it comes to ecosystem development, hackathons and bounties as a way to distribute tokens to a community that might not seek them out otherwise, but could really leverage them afterwards. It's hugely beneficial. One thing to do with community grants and Gitcoin, the Gitcoin model is very much predicated on quadratic funding in particular. The voice of the individual really matters. So, $100 from one person is worth far less than, $10 for 10 people. Really thinking about their broad distribution. So many people are, have ownership in something, have a stake in making it succeed. We think this is really effective because it's a rallying point for users to engage with the ecosystem. As I mentioned before, it gives people a sense of ownership. But given a lot of, projects in our space are also premised on retaining talented developers, I think it really helps to retain, very bright developers who might not be very vocal, but definitely have a view, and their view would fall through the cracks otherwise. This is something that the Ethereum Foundation calls the subtraction mindset. Instead of pulling everything in-house, resources are pushed out to teams across the ecosystem. And it's, I do believe it's really critical to build a long-run sustainable ecosystem to ensure long-term decentralization.
Thank you. That's great. And maybe we can delve further into the kind of mechanisms behind the voting on who wins those different prizes. But and as we pass this sort of question around, if you're looking at prizes versus grants versus funding projects through investment, maybe you could sort of comment on which is better. Are they just different, or is some going out of fashion? I think that would be interesting to expand on that. Erik, for being fair, let's go to you next.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there's just one thing worth clarifying up front, and that's I think there is a difference. Basically, so people will join a community for a variety of different reasons, and not all of those are financial, right? So I mean, you have the people who join for the vision, you have the people who join because their friends are there, you have people who join because it gives them a good lifestyle. There's a cool team, it's good for their career, right? money is a powerful motivator, but it's not the only one, or money equivalents are powerful. So I think it is just worth pausing and just noting that up front. Another thing I think the progression of these projects is similar to the progression of how communities tend to operate anyways, right? Like you have to start with one, and then you have the first joiner, and the first person looks crazy until they have the first joiner, who's actually, there's a TED talk about that, right? Like where the first person to join is actually the one that makes the crazy person no longer crazy, and you start getting this sort of blossoming push outwards. And we also kind of think about, how do we start with this concentric circle of, there's a founding team, and then there's a founding team with a bunch of people working with them. And then suddenly, and you have this sort of bubble that grows outwards from that sort of that seed of the idea into this very, very decentralized circle. So, at the sort of the center of that circle, you have direct incentives, right? That's things like, hey, we have a lot of things that need to get done. We know that they need to get done. We have ways of incentivizing people. Some of them involve tokens and things like that. So we have a contributor program, for instance, on our side, right? That says like, here's how everyone is being incentivized to do a very specific set of work. But then beyond that, like that's not scalable. That's inherently linear. The amount of effort that we put in is the same as the amount of energy or the amount of output that comes out of the community from that. And then, so if you want to scale that, you need to start scaling that somehow quadratically. And in order to do that properly, I mean, the next circle out is, how do you incentivize people who own their own communities? And so in our case, we have something that's called the Guild program, which is basically a way of incentivizing community owners and community leaders from around the ecosystem. Still, us hopefully providing them with good reasons, good incentives, good support to do their work, but spreading that out one layer beyond, to where we're no longer actually pulling all the strings. We're just sort of showing them the path and letting them run with it. And then I think the most powerful place to be, and the place where everyone wants to end up, is a self-sustainable community, where it's no longer about, hey, we want to do a thing, or we think a thing should be done. It's more about the ecosystem is actually self-incentivized, and a lot of that I think does actually bubble up from the product level, in terms of, is the product interesting and effective, and helping people build cool stuff, and like that's obviously the end goal of where these things go. So is it a grant program? Should there be venture funding? All of these are interesting questions, but I think you kind of have to start with the model. But I think some of the funding ones, actually, Andy would be a great person to address.
Yeah, so we'll go on to Andy, and I'm not sure whether we have more than 3 minutes to go, but Andy, why don't you pile in right this second, comment on that. And the thing that struck me on that, though, is that kind of conventional wisdom for building, a young company, building a young project, building a startup, is to really be very focused and do things a step at a time. But you've got organizations now that effectively not only end up, they kind of have to do everything at the same time. It's kind of like you're starting the product, you're building the community, and you're dealing with exchanges for your token, possibly all at the same time, or close to. I know that we can put people on the moon, or even into orbit, whatever the rest of it. So it's possible to tackle these complexities. But is that a correct characterization? How do you see projects dealing with that?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard, and I think one of the hardest things is that we can all sit around and make predictions about what models are going to work, but it's just really early in the industry, and it's not yet clear, first of all, which models are going to be successful in the long term, because this industry has not been around term yet. But even more so, we don't know if different models are going to work for different types of projects, and what works for one project, even once we get those data points, may not work for others. So, I would say holistically, what I'm in favor of is experimentation in the spirit of decentralization. And if anyone comes up with an interesting new model, whether it's the Gitcoin quadratic funding model, whether it's grants, whether it's developer programs, whether it's airdrops, whether it's venture funding, whatever it is, if it is in the favor of building towards a more decentralized, more productive, more effective and efficient network, I'm in favor of it, and I want to see how it works. And I think we'll get some early data points as these start to play out. But really, the question will be, in 5-10 years, once these networks are really mature, what worked, what didn't, what was high leverage, what accomplished the different goals. And so, yeah, I recognize a little bit of a non-answer, but yeah, it's a tough one, and we just gotta experiment and figure out what to do.
No, it makes sense. So, I mean, I think there's clearly opportunities both for innovation in the space in general, but also for people who want to get involved in these different communities to kind of connect with you. So I'm understanding that we do unfortunately have to wrap up a little bit briefer than we'd hoped. So just as a kind of sort of rapid fire, what's the biggest problem you'd like people to connect with you to help solve, and how do they find you around the houses? Min, magic wand, someone sends you a message, what problem would it solve for you?
Sorry, I'll skip that one. I cut out for a second, so pass it on to Erik first.
Erik,
Sure.
magic wand and the magic person falls.
I mean, for us, we're always just looking for really enthusiastic, interested people to help out around the world in different places, reaching areas and reaching people that we couldn't otherwise reach. So, whether that's local community leaders, people who run developer groups, people who know who translate blog posts. I mean, everything is helpful, and we love to talk to them.
And Andy, you?
Education, getting people more educated about decentralization, how it works, what projects are interesting.
And Min, second bite at the apple.
Absolutely. I have to agree with Andy on this one. Education is super important. And I think definitely extending the olive branch to, non-obvious communities and getting their buy-in and what appeals to them as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience and then for your great thinking. Hand it over to Anastasia.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.